I'm the policy. Oh, we're recording this. I hope it's okay with everybody. So I'm the policy director for the Tuolumne River Trust. And one challenge I have is that I have a lot of different audiences, including TRT members who might have been around for a long time, who might be new. And so sometimes I'm ahead of some people in the audience, sometimes I'm behind. And the idea for this was to do a general presentation on the Tuolumne River and the issues we face and things coming up. So I hope you're in the right place. Uh, there will be a lot of information. Most of it's digestible. The facts don't matter quite as much. They're more to convince you that we've got the facts. But the basics are that there's enough water to go around for the Tuolumne River and the Bay Delta, for the Bay Area, for agriculture. And the opposition to efforts to require higher flows in the Tuolumne River aren't justified. So we have a big campaign around that. So I'm going to start sharing some slides. And first one is just want to point out that right out of the gate, we got an executive order yesterday from the new president wanting to put people over fish and to stop radical environmentalism. Here's our uniter in chief. And so directing federal agencies to route more water from the Delta to other parts of California. So it's going to be a challenging year. It'll be an interesting year. So here's the Tuolumne River. You see it starts in Yosemite. It drains the northern half of Yosemite. Hetch Hetchy Reservoir is in Yosemite. That's owned and operated by the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. They deliver water to 2.7 million people in the Bay Area. They also generate hydroelectricity. Then downstream is Don Pedro Reservoir, the largest on the Tuolumne. It's about 6 times the storage capacity of Hetch Hetchy. And it's owned and operated by the Modesto and Turlock irrigation districts. And it's primarily used to irrigate 200,000 acres of farmland. And then you see the Tuolumne flows through Modesto. It joins the San Joaquin River, flows up into the Delta and the Bay. And these are the SFPUC customers. 1/3 of them are in San Francisco. 2/3 are on the peninsula and northern part of Santa Clara County, southern part of Alameda County. Those 2/3 that are outside of San Francisco, there are 26 agencies, and they're represented by a group called BOSCA, Bay Area Water Supply and Conservation Agency. And they're also known as wholesale customers, whereas customers in San Francisco are retail. So most of our water comes from Sierra snowmelt. As it melts, forms little streams. They join, get bigger, and just upstream of Tuolumne Meadows, the river takes its name, Tuolumne River. And then if you go downstream, you will pass through the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne. Wonderful backpacking trip if you enjoy doing that. Ends up right above Hetch Hetchy. And then Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. Hetch Hetchy wasn't always there. And the history of water in San Francisco, before I move on, just it is very high quality water. There's no agriculture upstream, no factories. So when Willie Brown was mayor, he actually toyed with the idea of bottling and selling Hetch Hetchy water. It turned out that that was not allowed. So these are just collector's items, but very high quality water. So a little history of water in San Francisco. Um, for the early days, it was all on-site water from creeks, maybe a little bit of groundwater. And sometimes it was delivered in these water trucks, very, very valuable, very expensive at the time. And with the gold rush, San Francisco started to grow rapidly. Spring Valley Water Company built a dam on San Mateo Creek to create Crystal Springs Reservoir. They created some other reservoirs. So this is a private company that sold water very expensively to San Franciscans. And the San Francisco started looking for its own water supply and to have a public utilities commission. And they looked to the Sierra and they found this site, Hetch Hetchy Valley. in Yosemite National Park that they felt would be a wonderful place for a reservoir. The name Hetch Hetchy comes from the grasses that grow in this valley that were very important to the indigenous people who lived in the area. So they proposed damming Hetch Hetchy Valley to create a water supply that would be gravity fed all the way to San Francisco. This here is Michael O'Shaughnessy, a civil engineer in San Francisco at the time. The plan was opposed by John Muir and the Sierra Club. You can't build infrastructure for a city in a national park. And the Sierra Club was successful at blocking the dam. But then we had the big earthquake in 1906, fires, a lot burned down. There wasn't, kind of similar to LA, the water pressure wasn't there. There wasn't enough water. So there was more sympathy in Congress, and in 1913, Congress allowed building the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. The act was called the Raker Act, named after a representative from Manteca, and it broke John Muir's heart. So they started constructing what became known as O'Shaughnessy Dam, named after Michael O'Shaughnessy, who oversaw the building. And O'Shaughnessy Dam was completed, or the first phase in 2023, the second and final phase in 2033. I'm sorry, 1913 and 1923. And downstream, we still have rainbow trout. And actually, we have a campaign we're working on now. I see a couple of our friends from CSERC, Central Sierra Environmental Resource Center, that are working with us, along with others, to improve conditions for fish downstream of Hetch Hetchy. And I don't have time to go into that, but it's a real opportunity we have. It's been around for a long time. If you're interested in that stretch of the river, let me know. Rainbow trout are interesting. They can stay landlocked and reproduce as rainbow trout. But if they can go to the ocean, they can become steelhead. And there's a lot more food in the ocean, so they get really big like this one, and they come back to spawn. Now, they can't make it in this stretch below Hetch Hetchy because of the big dam Don Pedro downstream. But there are talks about fish passage, getting fish above the dams to reproduce and then back down. I don't have time to go into that right now, and it's probably not going to happen in the next 4 years, but it's still on the table. So we have great whitewater rafting on the upper Tuolumne. A lot of our supporters are rafters, including some of our founders. There's a lot of other wonderful recreations, very scenic. But there was a proposal in the late 70s to add more dams to the upper Tuolumne that would have destroyed all this. So Tuolumne River Trust was established in 1981. This is our first director speaking, John Amadeo. This is at um, a, a hearing in Washington, D.C. Over on the far left, looking at him, is Richard Chamberlain, who some of you might remember. He was a TV heartthrob from the Thornbirds back in the 70s. He fell in love with the Tuolumne, and whenever he was doing an interview on Good Morning America or another outlet, he would say, "I'll do it, but I get to talk about the Tuolumne River." So it became a very national issue. And in 1984, we secured wild and scenic designation for the upper 83 miles of the Tuolumne. So that means you can't build dams, you can't develop along the banks. So that was part of the California Wilderness Protection Act. Again, this is Don Pedro Dam. It's about 600 feet high, so you can't really put a fish ladder over it. And 2 miles downstream from it is LaGrange Dam, which has a much smaller reservoir behind it. But LaGrange, what it does is it elevates the water, and then the water goes through canals on both sides to irrigate farmland in the Modesto Irrigation District area and the Turlock Irrigation District area. LaGrange originally did not require a license, so dams that generate hydropower require a federal license. Don Pedro got its license in 1966, so it was supposed to be licensed by 20 2016. We've been working on it since 2011. We got LaGrange, a requirement that LaGrange get a license, and we're in that process now. Because LaGrange now requires a license, there's an opportunity to pursue fish passage. So that's how we got that in there. And I won't talk a lot about the relicensing right now. It's kind of waiting to see what happens with the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan, which I'll focus on a lot more a little bit later. And that's a state plan. So those two dams separate the upper Tuolumne, which again is wild and scenic, from the lower Tuolumne, which is getting a lot of attention these days. The lower Tuolumne is very different than the whitewater up coming out of the Sierra. This is now in the Central Valley. Really beautiful area, close to the dams, kind of flat water. It's moving, but not as fast, and it's very good for canoeing and kayaking. We have our paddle with the salmon trips the first 2 weekends in November. That's when they spawn. These are fall run Chinook salmon. And they can make it up to those dams, and that's as far as they can go now. So close to the dams is the really good spawning territory. And fall run are also known as king salmon because they're the largest. This one is amazingly large, over 100 pounds. Normally, they might get to be 20 or 30. But salmon are really, really important to the whole ecosystem because they're born in the freshwater. They go out to the ocean where there's a lot more food. And when it's time to reproduce, they come back to their river. They can actually smell the river. And they bring all those nutrients from the ocean and they come up and they lay their eggs and die. And all those nutrients then support the food web. Many other species depend on those nutrients. And they also fertilize the soils. So we think of it more as a salmon-based ecosystem than just a fish species. So the challenge is in an average year, only 21% of the Tuolumne's natural flow reaches the San Joaquin River. So humans take 4 out of every 5 gallons. And you see here that the salmon population has suffered the worst decline of any Central Valley river. The three in the box in the red are the three main tributaries to the San Joaquin River. The other ones are tributaries to the Santa Sacramento or directly enter the Delta. And so the San Joaquin River is heavily tapped for agriculture, and you see that the Tuolumne salmon population is worse off than any of the others. So just a couple of success stories on the lower Tuolumne. Dennett Dam was built in Modesto to create kind of a swimming area. This may be back in 1930s or 40s, and it kept getting washed out, and then it was abandoned. And then it became a real problem because it was blocking all sorts of stuff. Here you see invasive water hyacinth, an old boat, and there's a little spillway there, which a couple of kids drowned there, so no one wanted to take responsibility for removing it. An impediment to fish migration. So TRT stepped up and we partnered with the city of Modesto and we raised the money for studies and to get the work done to remove it. And that dam is no longer there. So it's much better for recreation and for fish. And then down at the confluence where the Tuolumne joins the San Joaquin in 2012, TRT and River Partners purchased 1,500 acres, 1,600 acres for $22 million. Got a lot of state and federal grants for that. Shortly thereafter, another 500 acres were added, and what's called Dos Rios. The area was restored to wildlife habitat. This little brush rabbit up in the top right is one of the most endangered species in California. We're seeing them come back. And in June, it was dedicated as the newest state park, I believe the first one in 15 years. So that was a nice success story. So the Tuolumne has joined the San Joaquin. The San Joaquin flows into the Delta. Coming from the north is the Sacramento. There are the three east side tributaries. And the Delta is connected to San Francisco Bay. And basically, everyone acknowledges the San Francisco Bay Delta is an ecosystem in crisis. So, what to do about it? Well, the Clean Water Act, which we hope will survive the current administration, was passed in 1972. It required these water quality plans. The Bay Delta Plan was first adopted in 1978. It was updated in 1995, and it hasn't been updated since. So now we're in year 30. And what triggered this update that has taken a long, long time was the Delta Reform Act in 2009, and it established co-equal goals of ensuring a reliable water supply and restoring the Bay Delta ecosystem. So they're supposed to be on equal footing. So the Bay Delta is a really important ecosystem. I think of it as our Garden of Eden. Half of the precipitation that falls on California drains out through the Delta down the Sacramento Basin or up from San Joaquin. Provides incredible habitat for biodiversity, more than 500 species of fish and wildlife. It's a major stopover for the Pacific Flyway. It's the migration corridor for anadromous fish, fish that start in freshwater, go out to the ocean, come back to spawn. So steelhead, salmon, a few others. And it's changed a lot with Western development of California. These floodplains down in the Delta that were really, really critical habitat were converted to farmland. So levees were put up. And then upstream, we started getting a lot of dams and diversions. And now, in an average year, only half of the natural freshwater flows out through the Delta. And in dry years, it might be down to only a third. So flows are really important. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The water agencies are saying, oh, we can produce more fish with less water. But here are a few things that are so important about flows. So water temperature, which is really important. These are cold water fish. They're used to the snow melt in the spring, and water quality, diluting out ag chemicals and other things. Obviously, fish need water to migrate, and we think about them coming in, but the real challenge is getting out. So the baby fish need high enough flows to flush them out quickly before they might get eaten by invasive predators like bass. Water is really important to inundate floodplains. This is critical rearing habitat for the baby fish. The big predators, a lot of them are bass, non-native, are in the main channel. So if the baby fish have a place to get away from them, they have refuge, and there's also a lot more food. They can grow bigger, and when it's time for them to out-migrate, they have a much better chance of surviving. And essentially, we've altered the ecosystem from a fast-moving cold river to a slow-moving warm stream that favors non-native species that have evolved in those conditions. So here you see the water hyacinth. It's from South America. It just takes over in drier years. And underneath that, we have bass, a warm water fish. And then when you get down to the delta, you might occasionally read about these toxic algae blooms or harmful algae blooms. So this warm, nutrient-rich, slow-moving water is perfect habitat for cyanobacteria that creates neurotoxins, can kill animals, pets, and can make people very sick. And you've probably heard that the salmon fishing season was canceled for the last 2 years. It looks like it might be canceled again this year. So the salmon population is in really serious decline. So the Bay Delta Plan. Phase one focuses on the lower San Joaquin River and its three major tributaries. The Tuolumne is one of those. In 2018, the State Water Board adopted an update that requires 40% of unimpaired flow between February and June. So February and June, those are critical months for baby fish rearing and outmigration. Humans would still be able to take 3 out of 5 gallons those months, but guaranteeing 40%. The plan has not been implemented yet. one reason, oh, before I get there, I'll just mention that a really important component of the plan is something called adaptive management. So the flows would start at 40%, but if biological goals like number of fish could be met with lower flow, it could go down to 30%. If they're not being met at 40, it could go up to 50%. So this is to incentivize water agencies to do non-flow measures like habitat restoration. This photo in the upper left is they're removing a salmon from a bass. So that represents trying to control non-native species. Then you've got gravel augmentation for spawning on the right, and then you've got riparian um, vegetation restoration. So there's an incentive to let's do the non-flow measures that the state can't require, but let's encourage them, and we'll use the flow measures to do that. So one of the reasons the implementation got slowed down is the irrigation districts sued the State Water Board, but also the SFPUC joined them, and BOSCA, again, the agency that represents those of us outside of San Francisco, sued as well. Those lawsuits, they lost last March. They're appealing now, but we at least got through that. What the water agencies have proposed is what's called a voluntary agreement. And we're very opposed to these voluntary agreements because they're just checklists. So in this case, they're committing to do a certain number of things, but there's no guarantee that they'll work. And there's no adaptive management. If they don't work, well, we're going to try the higher water. So uh, there's no guarantee there. And the National Marine Fisheries Service commissioned a peer review of the fish models they used to produce their voluntary agreement and found a number of major flaws which have never been addressed. You don't have to read all these right now. So, a big reason why the SFPUC is suing is because they have a contractual obligation with the irrigation districts since 1995 to follow the irrigation district's lead on fish flows. So they needed something from the districts and they said, okay, if you give us that, we will follow your lead if any agency says we need to release more water. But they can't say, oh, we're opposing this because we have this contractual obligation. So they had to fabricate a reason. And a month after the environmental document came out for the Bay Delta Plan, so this is a couple years before it got adopted, the general managers of the SFPUC and BOSCA had this editorial in the Chronicle, and they said this could lead to 51% rationing. And you still see that number. Chris, I know you've seen it recently. Um, we could lose 188,000 jobs and we could lose 49 billion in sales transactions. So we saw this editorial. Here are the numbers here, 188,000 jobs, $49 billion. And we said, where did those numbers come from? 2 years ago, you asked us to look at your draft report, and the numbers were 2.5 times smaller. And they said, well, these are based on a report from 2009 that got finalized, and 2014 is just a draft. And it's like, but it's by the same author who hastily put together this report in 2009. Then he took 5 years to flesh it out, and you're cheating. You're using the most alarming numbers you can come up with. So here was the draft. The final report had very similar numbers, but they never corrected their figures. And regardless, what happened in the from 2010 to 2016 is that we added 27% more jobs and our water use declined by 23%. So it was really quite remarkable and the exact opposite of what was predicted. So we got all the data so we can check their numbers, SFPUC's numbers, and we looked at, well, what if the worst drought on record repeated? So this is 1987 to 1992, 6 years. And we used current demand, which was 198 million gallons per day. And we assumed, okay, what happens if there's no rationing, if we don't change our habits at all? And we found, okay, storage in the reservoirs decreases, but it never goes down to zero. And we said, why? This is with the Bay Delta plan in place. It's like, why are you suing? It's not a problem with rationing. You could add a year to your planning horizon. with a little bit of alternative water supplies like recycled water. You could add more time. And they said, well, we're not planning for the worst drought on record. We have our design drought, which takes that drought, 6 years, and combines it with the driest 2 year period on record, 76, 77. And we're assuming demand will eventually be 265 million gallons per day. So what they did is this shows all the blue lines are years that are above average with flows, and the orange is below. So they took the driest 6 year period and added the driest 2 year period. And it's not just any 2 years. What you see here is the severity of a drought. So the 6 year drought, um, the difference between their water entitlements during those 6 years and the water demand was 707,000 acre feet, which means they had to take that water out of storage. So you can think of this as water needed out of storage. And 77 was such a dry 2 year period that it was not that much less severe. So you combine them together, statistically, the odds of that happening are very, very small, as we'll talk about later. But they've created a drought that's 72% more severe than the worst drought on record. And that includes looking at 1,100 years of tree ring data. So what is required in urban water management plans is that you plan for your driest 5 year sequence at least. So that's these bars here. And it's encouraged to do an extra year. And here we got San Francisco, that's the outlier, planning for their design drought. So a little bit of history. Back in 1977, the city of Palo Alto and some other wholesale customers sued San Francisco because they were proposing a 20% increase in water rates outside of San Francisco, but only 14% in San Francisco. And they said San Francisco was transferring money from the utility to general fund services, and that money really should be put back into the water system. Well, they were right. Palo Alto and others were right. And San Francisco took a while to really get it. But in the early 2000s, there was a USGS report that came out and said, we're going to be having a big earthquake again at some point. They put out some percentage chance. And you see the Hetch Hetchy line crosses the Calaveras Fault and the Hayward Fault, and then the San Andreas Fault is very close to the system there. So this got Bosca's attention, and they got local legislators to pass legislation in the state that gave Bosca more standing, that forced San Francisco to move on system upgrades, so deferred maintenance of these on the capital system. And that led to the Water System Improvement Program in 2008. So this was $4.8 billion plus debt service on 80 plus capital improvement projects to make sure the system could withstand a major earthquake. So when you have to pay for these things, you got to raise rates. And our rates have quadrupled since 2008. So that sent a price signal to people, and they started taking advantage of rebate programs and started using water more efficiently. When I was a kid growing up in Palo Alto, we played in the sprinklers all the time. All of a sudden, you can't do that anymore. So this is what what deliveries from the SFPUC are per year. And here about right here is when the Water System Improvement Program was adopted. And so there's a quick decline in water, and it kind of plateaued for a while. And then we had the drought in the teens, and it dropped quite a bit, but it never quite rebounded. And for the last 10 years, demand has been under 200 million gallons per day. So it's really quite impressive. And 3 of those years, you'll see that demand was lower than back in 1977, 78, despite population growth. So at the time of the Water System Improvement Program, their projection was that by 2018, demand would be 285 million gallons per day. we challenged them based on they wanted to take more money, more water out of the Tuolumne. We supported the seismic upgrades, but can't take any more water out of the Tuolumne. And the general manager, who we got along pretty well, he offered a compromise where they capped water sales at 265 million gallons per day. You'll hear that number a lot, 265, and make up any deficit through water conservation and recycled water. But look at the actual. The actual in 2018 was 31% below what they had projected. So the general manager looked really good. There were no lawsuits. We were happy. It's like, look, we got plenty of water for the environment. But the SFPUC didn't agree. So now in their 10-year capital plan, the SFPUC is planning to invest another $4.4 billion in water projects. And I'm sure it'll end up being higher because they always have cost overruns. So how will this impact water demand and water rates? As demand goes down, rates have to go up to cover the costs. So this just looks at debt service, which is a huge problem for the SFPUC and for us who buy water from them. You see the blue here is existing debt service. So we're still paying off a lot of the water system improvement program. At the same time, we're taking on a lot more debt. So this is going to be a huge problem. The SFPUC budget has just been exploding. This year it grew by $3 billion. This is a 10-year budget, $3 billion to 11.8 billion. Now, if you live in San Francisco, you should be really concerned. If you live outside of San Francisco, a little less concerned because we have to pay a percentage of the water. The green is sewer in San Francisco, and that is going to hit them really hard. And then they also have power in San Francisco. So why is sewer going to hit them hard? Well, they deferred maintenance on their wastewater system for a long time too. So you might remember that 2 years ago, there was a toxic algae bloom in the bay. So this is fueled by nitrogen from wastewater treatment plants from releasing water. And there's a new rule that everyone's got to clean it up. So San Francisco, they are doing something about that, but it's going to cost a lot of money. The thing they want to move a lot more slowly on is, meanwhile, the Environmental Protection Agency ordered them to clean up their act on the Pacific Ocean side of the city, where during big storms, the storm water joins the sewer system and it overflows and you get sewage being released into creeks and the ocean. And instead of working with EPA, San Francisco sued. And this case is now before the United States Supreme Court. There's going to be a ruling in the spring. And it could be that in the future, when people talk about the death of the Clean Water Act, they'll refer to San Francisco versus EPA. So it's really quite shocking that San Francisco is, in bed with fossil fuel and mining and other industries that want to weaken the Clean Water Act. So, San Francisco manufactured this whole tale about, what will happen if the Bay Delta plan is implemented. And their commissioner said, well, we can't run out of water. What's our plan? So they had to come up with this alternative water supply plan, which I don't think anyone on staff feels like was necessary or is a legitimate document. But they had to use the same figures, the same exaggerated demand figures. They had to use the design drought. So they produced this plan that suggests they might need to develop between 92 million gallons per day and 122 million gallons per day of very expensive alternative water. It would cost between 17 billion and 25 billion dollars to develop this water. This column on the left that says ends up with 122, that's based on if every agency that has a contract with them maxes out their need with the design drought, that's what would be required. This was the only number they presented to their commission or to the public for many years. We had to kept saying that, you know, there are, that is an extreme. You need to look at what the reality is. On the right is the exaggerated reality. It's the high end. And we've been saying it's like, well, what's the low end? You've even admitted that this is an outside envelope, but they refuse to budge. So it's really important that water agencies determine how much water do we really need. Um, let's let's listen to the SFPUC, but let's listen to TRT and others who have been digging into this for a long time, and let's not overbuild, because if you invest in a lot of infrastructure that's not needed, people still have to pay for it. So their rates go up, their demand goes down because of the price signal, and you end up in a death spiral, a financial death spiral where you ultimately could go bankrupt. So really important to get these numbers right. So every 5 years, a city or water agency has to update its urban water management plan. The SFPUCs and its wholesale customers, they're going to be starting this process at the end of this year, and it'll be going till late June of 2026. Great. If you're interested in getting involved on the ground floor or something and learning about your water agency or about the PUC and crunching numbers and working with us to try to get them to be better plans, let me know. But their water demand is, they're all based on numbers that come from the SFPUC's water enterprise. And you see they're always expected to go up. So the blue is the wholesale Bosca demand, the green is San Francisco, and then you get the total. So the projection from 2020 was that this year, 2025, demand would be 216 million gallons per day. Well, last year was 184. So they're way off just in the first 5 years of this. Now, this is actual demand. So we can see it's been in decline for the last 25 years. And their 2000 urban water management plan projected much higher demand uh, going out. Always they're projecting demand's going to go up, but it's been going down. So at the same time, the SFPUC has a finance bureau and they set rates. And so they do sales projections and they don't want to over project. If they say, oh, we're going to need 244 million gallons per day, or we're going to sell 244 million gallons per day, and they end up only selling 207, then there's a huge deficit and they got to correct all of that. So they have been much closer to accurate than what goes into the urban water management plans. But we finally got the SFPUC to compare the two. We convinced a couple commissioners to say, yeah, you got to show us the difference between these two. And these dashed lines are the urban water management plans. So you see, it's like, they're expecting demand to get up to 300 million gallons per day. These dotted lines are the 10-year financial plans, which don't go back as far, but you can see they over projected too, but are much closer. And this history of over projecting, it's always been the case. Each of these lines is a different water demand projection back in the 70s and 80s. And you can see they were projecting water demand to get up to 400 or 450 million gallons per day. But here is the actual at the time. And then if you put on the rest of the actual, you see demand is half what they were expecting back then. But they designed the system for much higher demand, which puts us in a great position to leave more water in the river and be prepared for climate change. So they overprotected by two. We are we have much less demand. That gives us a lot of flexibility. So on the Tuolumne, they've got 3 reservoirs. There's a water bank way they can store water at Don Pedro. They have Bay Area reservoirs. So in total, they have enough water to last 6 years. So it might not rain for 5 years, but we're not running out of water. And they have really good water rights in average, even slightly below average, and wet years. So each bar is San Francisco PUC's water entitlement for the year. You can see a lot of these went above 2 million acre feet. And my apologies, there are a lot of different units that we use. So million gallons per day is how we measure demand. Acre feet or 1,000 acre feet is how we measure storage. And cubic feet per second is how we measure flow. So sometimes you have to do some conversion, but it's kind of easy. The demand in the Bay Area has been under 200 million gallons per day for the last 10 years. So I use 200 million gallons per day, and that's the equivalent of 225,000 acre feet per year. So two numbers that are pretty easy to remember. So in an average year, the SFPUC is entitled to this red line, and that's enough water to last 3 years. So any blue line above the red means they got more than 3 years worth of water, which they can put in storage in their reservoirs unless they're all full. This bottom red line is 1 year's worth of water, and you see there are very few years where they don't get as much water as they need. But if you take the 6 driest years and you combine them with the 2 driest years, uh, then you can manufacture a problem. So here's the drought in the teens, and here's how the water rights work. So this dashed line is divides what the irrigation districts are entitled to as senior water rights holders, and the green is what the SFPUC is entitled to. So this was established in the Raker Act that allowed the SFPUC to build Hetch Hetchy. For most of the year, the cutoff is 2,400 cubic feet per second. So a cubic foot per second is like one basketball of water per second. But for 2 months, it goes up to 4,000. So as the water's running off, if there's a lot of it, San Francisco can pick up a lot of water. If there's not much, it's more challenging. And in really dry years, San Francisco doesn't get a whole lot of water. But what happened here is we had 4 really dry years and then one average year, 2016. And at the end of that, San Francisco had enough water in storage to last 5 years. The state was still technically in drought. A lot of other areas were really tight on water. San Francisco was sitting on 5 years worth. And the next year, everything filled up for the whole state. But San Francisco has this paranoia. If their storage isn't full, they start getting really nervous. And in November 2021, they declared a water shortage emergency, encouraged everyone to conserve water. They imposed a drought surcharge on San Francisco customers. But at the time they declared this water shortage emergency, they had enough water in storage to last 4.5 years. They always have these charts. They have a water supply update in their agendas, but for this one meeting, they didn't have this. And I'm sure it's because they didn't want people looking at it. It's like, why are we declaring a water shortage emergency when we have 4.5 years worth of water in storage? But it allowed them to charge San Francisco customers 5% more to make up for the 5% they weren't using. So people paid the same amount for less water. And people think that conserving water is good for the environment. In fact, surveys show it's the #1 motivator for people to conserve. But in our situation, the conserved water doesn't help the environment. Because what happens is in dry years, they only release the minimum required flow. So there's a base flow right now. You can't go below 50 CFS or 300 CFS. It depends on the year and time of year. So they hoard water. And if you look at the drought in the teens, for 5 years, they starved the river. The unimpaired flow in the lower Tuolumne averaged 12%. And then in 2017, all that water we conserved got spilled with a lot more water. So all the reservoirs filled and they had to release 79%. And you see this pattern repeats every time we have a dry sequence, including recently. So terrible management if you care about salmon and the ecosystem. What about climate change? Well, they came out with this climate change study at the end of 2021 called a long-term vulnerability assessment. And we got a lot of great information out of it. The SFPUC has never cited from it because it doesn't support their narrative. So they've been very quiet. I mean, they spent $750,000 on a state-of-the-art climate study and they never reference it. So the good news is that they found that, well, we're going to have drier years, we're going to have wetter years, but over a long-term average, there's no clear direction of whether there's going to be more precipitation or less. We can expect it long-term average to be about the same. Pretty good news. It's high up in the system. It's different than a lot of other places in the state. Um, it's cooler, so we have a good setup. Now, they had return periods, which is the likelihood of occurrence for the known droughts. So, you know, a repeat of 76, 77 might happen once every 100 years. But they didn't have one for the design drought. And it's like, well, isn't that the whole purpose of this? Weren't we kind of trying to determine whether the design drought made sense or if it was overkill and could lead to a lot of overinvestment in alternative water supplies? And SFPUC said, well, it was just too complicated. But then through a Public Records Act request, we got a document that did look from a year earlier, the same people who did the study, that did look at the design drought, and they said a design drought that severe might occur once in every 25,000 years. Now, the SFPUC would say it's like, well, you know, the numbers we had back then weren't very good, so we recalibrated and we came up with new numbers. So here's the difference between that report I just showed you and what made it into the final plan. And we said, okay, fair enough. So you reduced the original numbers to 31% of what they were. We'll do that for 25,000. Now we're looking at a design drought that might occur once in 8,000 years. So human civilization is maybe 12,000 years old. So 2/3 of the entire human civilization. And that's what you want us to plan for. And this is the low end of the return period. Another number they had in here, which is very solid, is here's how much water would be needed out of storage, 1.3 million acre feet. And they looked at 100 years of observed data, 1,100 years of tree ring data, and they did 25,000 simulated model runs. And these are the worst. As you go to the right, the droughts get more severe, but there are fewer of them. And the worst one uses about under 1.2 million acre feet of water out of storage. And here's the design drought. They couldn't produce a drought as severe as the design drought, but every number they put out is based on the design drought. So in San Francisco, they combine water and sewer rates because you don't meter wastewater, but you assume water coming in, certain percentage is going to go out. And so they're looking at the combined rates tripling by 2044 in 20 years. And you see a lot of that is the wastewater. So if you don't live in San Francisco, you don't need to worry so much about that, although your own community is probably dealing with upgrading infrastructure as well. And here's what's really alarming. So this is the SFPUC's annual debt. Now, last year's budget was $1.8 billion. And what we're looking at is just their debt alone by 2047 is going to be equal to last year's entire budget for the SFPUC. Now, the orange here is wastewater, the gray is power, and the blue is water. But they're in for a really, really tough time, and we as customers are going to be suffering along with them. So I want to wrap up with what we can do. Now, we're kind of shifting gears a little bit because we talked a lot about phase one of the Bay Delta plan that focuses on the Tuolumne and the Stanislaus and Merced rivers. But right now we're embroiled in phase two. And on Thursday of this week, 2 days from now, there will be a workshop. It's the last of 5 workshops. And we're encouraging people to participate and to speak. And you don't have to be an expert. You only get 2 or 3 minutes, so enough time to introduce yourself and say a key talking point or two. We've got a lot of good information online that you can just quickly figure out how it works. And I think that Renee is posting something in the chat. So if you get a chance to look at that. Um, so phase two, the recommended plan is starting at 55% unimpaired flow for the San Joaquin River and its tributaries. Um, Better than what we've been looking at. The environment could use more, but personally, if we get 55%, I will be impressed. Because here again, the water agencies are not just working with each other, but working with the governor and some of his resource departments to promote voluntary agreements. So these are alternatives to the stuff we've been working on for so long. They recently renamed them Healthy Rivers and Landscapes. So good old greenwashing. And the governor, he's not great on water policy. He's actually bad on water policy. He's willing to compromise ecosystems in order to get, donors who might help with his presidential campaign. Um, so these voluntary agreements, the nonprofits and tribes and others were not involved in negotiating them. They're based on Trump's biological opinion from 2019, which we're going to probably see even worse one. So biological opinion is looking at, how do the delta pump operations that move water out of the delta impact endangered species? And the LA Times uncovered that there were the first scientists who look at it came up with a report that said, "Oh yeah, pumping more water will have a big impact on endangered species." And then the Trump administration sidelined them and replaced them with folks who said, "Oh, no problem at all." So that's what we're dealing with there. Um, they don't really set water quality objectives. Really hard to account for anything that's promised that won't materialize. There's no real adaptive management plan, so you got to have like, hey, if this isn't working, what are we going to do, or how much more water are we going to add? And they'd only last 8 years. So it's like this process has already taken 12 years. um, so it's pretty infuriating. There are 5 board members with the State Water Board. They're appointed by the governor. What happened in 2018 was we had a really great chair named Felicia Marcus, and she was a leader. And in December of 2018, the Water Board adopted phase one. In January, her term was up, a 4-year term, and Governor Newsom did not reappoint her. So that sent a chill throughout the board. It's like, okay, we know who our boss is. If we want to continue to be on this board, we got to play the game. And my thing is like, I would never serve on a board where I had to compromise my values and science and facts. So we'll see. We're going to put some pressure on them. We need them to see that a lot of people really care. And that's why it's important to speak on Thursday. If they see, just speaker after speaker coming from this area and that area with this interest or that, and that they're paying attention and they took time out of their day to come and comment, that could have an impact because the big emphasis is this is a legacy vote. This is our chance to protect the Garden of Eden, the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas, and to restore it. And they know what the right thing is, but there's a lot of political pressure. So one thing is the workshop is on Thursday. If you're interested in these things, you can watch panels and you know learn from our side a little bit and from their side, the other side a little bit. Um, and the public comment will be in the afternoon. And if you're interested and willing, if you let me know and you give me your cell phone number, when they start public comment, I'll send you a text. And when your name gets added to the speaker scroll, so kind of saying, hey, you're up in about 5 minutes, I'll send you another text. So you can just, look at our talking points. We have a video training if you want to look at that. Just take out a few points, a few things that you heard today. Now, this isn't focusing so much on the Tuolumne because that was phase one. This is phase two. But some of the general points, and you just craft a little 2 or 3 minute comment, and then on Thursday, if you choose to go this route, you get a text saying, okay, at some point in the next hour or so, you might be called. and then you get another text shortly before. And so you just join, you say your comment, and you go back to what you were doing. So we can really use help with that. And that, I think I promised you I was probably going to overwhelm you a little bit. I hope not too much. Um, but we have 1 minute for all your comments. Actually, I can stick around for a while. So anyone who wants to stick around, I can probably stick around for about 15 minutes. But anybody, maybe use your raise hand and yeah, Jan.
Hi, Peter. Thanks. This is a really good information. A couple clarifying questions first. So, where do the main withdrawals happen? In the upper Tuolumne, which is wild and scenic, lower Tuolumne, or only after it's in the San Joaquin? Where are the
Okay.
withdrawals?
So on the Tuolumne, San Francisco gets its water from Hetch Hetchy.
Right.
The irrigation districts get their water from Don Pedro. And then any water that's not captured or diverted will flow down the river into the San Joaquin. There are some riparian water rights folks, farmers who will pick up a little bit of the water, but it'll flow down the San Joaquin, and there are these huge pumps in the southern delta,
Okay.
managed by the Central Valley Project, which is federal, and the State Water Project, which is state. So
Okay.
some dams are owned by the Fed, some by the state, some are owned by public agencies like SFPUC or the irrigation districts.
Okay.
So the Bay Delta Plan is really looking at the delta pumps. So making sure water is coming down rivers, enough is coming down rivers like the Tuolumne, um,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
also enough water is entering the delta and then exiting the delta, not just getting picked up by the pumps.
Okay. So I guess that was I got one more clarifying question and answer. So what percentage of the withdrawals are for agriculture versus residential use along the
Yeah.
whole
So
watershed? Because
so statewide in an average year, about 50% of the water stays in the environment. And a lot of that is like Northern California rivers, and they're
Mhm.
it's flown out. For the Bay Delta, it's a little less than that. Um, so of the water that humans use, 80% is used for agriculture and 20% for urban. And the breakdown on the Tuolumne is pretty much the same.
Okay.
So
So
agriculture is, that's there's a huge demand for agriculture. A lot like on for Tuolumne River water, the
mhm,
farmers who use the water, they pay $25 per acre foot. We in the Bay Area pay 2,500. We pay 100 times more. And so there's not an incentive for them to really use water more efficiently, but
mhm,
it provides an opportunity that we in the urban areas could could fund their infrastructure to use water more efficiently or to store water in the ground to get it into the ground at a fraction of the cost it would cost us to do recycled water for drinking, things like that. So a partnership would make a lot of sense. And but they're not talking about it because they never want to show that there are solutions.
right. And that's it. This might be my Thursday comment, and I'll let someone else ask a question here. But the thing is, if we can achieve relatively small reductions in agricultural withdrawals, then you retain enough flows for both residential use and for salmon and the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And some of the money, huge, billions, it could be invested in infrastructure. Some could be directed towards agricultural operations to transition those farms to less thirsty crops. Move off almonds or rice to other things in Turlock and Modesto districts, or certainly, redirect not growing food for animals, like
Yeah.
alfalfa or corn and soy, and put that towards human crops. So a fraction of the investment in how we use the water that is withdrawn on the agriculture side leaves enough for everyone.
Yeah,
Um,
I think it's a great comment to make. A
yeah,
5% reduction in ag, where it's much easier to come up with 5%,
right,
is much bigger than 5% in urban areas where it's a lot harder to come up with 5%
right,
reduction.
and it's for a fraction of the cost. I mean, just help those farmers transition to less thirsty crops, or just park their land. Make it non-productive. So just use less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
I'll look forward to your comment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I study this stuff. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Next person.
Renee, is there anything in the chat that we should respond to?
There's just a few questions, but I've been answering them, so I think we're pretty good. But just to share with everyone, the link to the webpage that Peter was talking about that has talking points and our video training about how to deliver public comment is in the chat. So check out the link there. And then there was one question, Peter, just around timing for Thursday. It sounded like you said most folks would deliver public comment in the afternoon. And we probably don't have any more granularity on that timeline. Is that true?
Yeah, what I'm expecting is the morning will be focusing on delta inflow and outflow and accounting. So things that are above my head. I mean, I will listen, I'll learn a little bit, and there will be an opportunity to comment on that issue, which I will not do. And I assume probably most people here wouldn't do. And then in the afternoon, they'll kind of, they might have another panel or two. So it's really hard to say when public comment will start. But it will be in the afternoon, general public comment. And again, I would be happy to text you if you let me know you want me to when they start that. And then again, when you're in the scroll. So you don't have to sit on the meeting all day.
Cool. And for anyone that fills out the speaker card, which you do need to do before delivering public comment, they'll confirm that you're on the roll, right? Isn't that right, Peter?
Yeah, yeah. So, and they say, they want you to fill out the speaker card 2 days in advance, but they're not strict on that. So don't worry about that. And what you'll do is you will then get a personal link that you shouldn't share with anyone else because it'd be linked to you. And so when you get online, you will be in a situation like we are here, whereas people who aren't going to speak are just watching on YouTube or whatever it is, and so they can't contribute. So you will see when you hit the link, you'll see your name in on a scene like this.
Now it looks like there was one other question in the chat about um, someone's asking, are the Resnicks of Wonderful Company directly involved in any of this part of the Bay Delta plan?
I'm sure they are. I mean, they're probably giving donations to Newsom and other people. Um, they don't show up and testify, but Westland's water district will testify, and I mean, all the water agencies are opposed to, if it's good for the environment, it probably can't be good for us when it comes to flows. Westland's in a interesting situation because they are, in a very poor natural water area, so they're always looking for new sources. They're probably got lobbyists trying to get the Trump administration to um, build up Shasta Dam to capture more water, and they're hoping to get some water from way up north to the southern part of San Joaquin Valley. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about the Resnicks and Westland this year.
So Peter, I'm a little confused about connecting with you to let us know where the process is time-wise. I'm seeing, at somebody else's name, Tierney, Patrick Tierney. I'm confused about how we're supposed to let you know our contact information.
Okay, so my email is peter@tuolumne.org, and Tuolumne is TUOLUMNE. Peter@tuolumne.org.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking. I'm sure other people have that question as well. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. Hope to see some of you on Thursday. I work with a lot of you on different projects. I just want to point out Tom Hicks is with us, and we've been working for 8 years to dedicate our water rights at Dos Rios to in-stream flow, dedicated in-stream flow. And Tom's a water rights lawyer, and he's been leading the charge, and he's got a lot of endurance and perseverance. But we are we are getting somewhere. So that could be really precedent setting. So we're
Just
trying to
going
do
out
our
of my
bit.
way to not raise my hand or say anything on your presentation. Because of course, my first instinct is just to give you a shout out for your policy expertise and your focus, your dedication to the Tuolumne. And I
Well,
want to honor that.
thanks.
Here, here.
I'm not an expert on water policy, but I know the Tuolumne pretty well, and um, I know my supporters and how to encourage them. So those might be my strengths.
Peter, will you be
If
posting
I can say
the
gently,
slide?
I was just
Chris,
gonna say, if
we're
I-
going to post this. Yes,
Thank you.
we'll post the video. You'll all get a link to it.
I
Tom?
think it's important just because since Peter brought it up, it's always easier to go second. But in this case, it's really important to recognize and create a conceptual placeholder for voluntary conservation transactions that include water rights that can be verified and quantified, and giving those so-called 1707 transfers a separate cell in the Excel spreadsheet so that they don't get conflated with these FERC waters, the city waters, the MID, TID. It's such a shell game. And I just, again, applaud Peter for kind of holding everybody's accounting to a level of integrity and honesty so that there's no confusion about double counting or having people somehow get off. And I think there's a real opportunity there. But it really has been working with Peter. That's one of the highlights of the project. So being able to ensure that voluntary conservation doesn't bump into in an antagonistic manner with the environmental work that goes through the courts and in other channels. They can be complementary, but again, here, the State Water Board leaves much to be determined.
Yeah, Tom referred to section 1707 of the Water Code, which allows us to go through this onerous process of voluntarily dedicating our water for free to the environment. And we want this to be an easier process so others might actually try to do it. But we don't want it to be confused with the voluntary agreement. So we want to voluntarily give our water, but we don't want the water agencies to get credit for it as part of a voluntary agreement. And we want them to give water too. So we're doing our share. You guys do your share. All right. Well, great to see you all. Email me if you have any questions or comments, and might see some of you on Thursday. And thank you, Renee. Ciao.
Thanks, everybody.